Hello, everyone. This is Craig from Acid Horizon, and I want to start by wishing you all a happy new year as we enter our 6th year of producing podcasts, publishing new work, and continuing to build the Acid Horizon Research Commons as a space for collective study and experimentation. Today's episode welcomes one of my friends and former teachers, Jay Conway. Together, we will dig into Plato and the Simulacrum, Gilles Deleuze's remarkable essay on reversing Platonism, an essay that functions kind of as a standalone or can be read in the appendix of Deleuze's The Logic of Sense. This conversation also serves as a way of opening up that text both philosophically and pedagogically. And that's especially timely for us because we will be launching The Logic of Sense reading group toward the end of January. I'll be including the initial syllabus in the show notes for this episode, along with a detailed reading schedule. Participation is open to anyone who joins our Patreon at the $5 level, so please join today. If you are listening on or before January 6th, note that that date is the final day to register for Acid Communism, a world that could be free, taught by Emma Stam. The class begins on the evening of January 6th, and there are only a handful of seats left. We also still have a few spots available in Nietzsche's Experiment with Truth, taught by Keegan Kjeldsen of the Nietzsche podcast, and that begins on January 14th. Links to both courses can be found in the show notes. All right, let's move now into our discussion of The Logic of Sense and officially kick off our 2026 reading group with my friend, Jay Conway. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. 10 years ago, in the month of January, I made what turned out to be a fateful decision. I applied to a master's program at Cal State LA. The practical reason was simple. It would be free for me to attend since I was already teaching within the Cal State system in a different field and department. But the deeper reason was less straightforward. I was at a crossroads coming off the heels of a personal and philosophical crisis of sorts, and I was hoping to rekindle a renewed engagement through the work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, work that had begun to speak to me again through a reading group held in a political organizing space. Philosophy had returned with a new urgency, and I was searching for a place where the impulses it awakened might be taken seriously. As I tried to learn more about the program, I reached out to several professors. The responses varied, but one stood out for its thoughtfulness and generosity. It came from Jay Conway, who was scheduled to teach a course on Marx and Engels in the early winter of 2016, and who, to my surprise, mentioned that the syllabus would also include Deleuze and Guattari. His reply reflected a genuine love for philosophy and suggested a shared commitment to a set of pedagogical values that already felt aligned with my own. I later learned that Jay had also completed his doctoral dissertation on Deleuze and the affirmation of philosophy, a theme that spoke directly to my own attempt to reorient myself toward philosophy amid frustration and disillusionment. So, today on the show, we have the pleasure of welcoming Jay as a guest at a moment when the Acid Horizon Collective is preparing to embark on a year-long reading of The Logic of Sense. And I can think of no better person to help open this space and to generate enthusiasm for engaging one of Deleuze's most challenging and rewarding works. More broadly, I hope that this conversation today foregrounds the importance of pedagogy in philosophy, not merely as instruction or transmission, but as a practice of affirmation, a way of sustaining thought, desire, and commitment to philosophy at moments when its value can no longer be taken for granted. Jay, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you for the beautiful welcome. It's such a pleasure to be with you and Adam, and I'm a big fan of the Acid Horizon podcast and everything connected to it, as well as a patron.
I think you were the first patron.
I love it.
Yes, and he still is. And that should be a lesson for anyone listening. Actually, let's just talk about your history as a philosopher, a student of philosophy, and perhaps even a student of the work of Deleuze.
In terms of thinking a little bit about my relationship to Deleuze, it goes back to my early years in graduate school at the University of South Florida. Now, I think that there were a lot of reasons for that engagement with Deleuze. One that really didn't come to fruition until I continued my graduate studies in California. Where like three things come to mind. There were a handful of professors that I really respected and learned so much from. And I heard that they had started a reading group and they had selected as their first book Anti-Oedipus. And then I heard that they had abandoned that book after the first 2 weeks because they regarded it as too difficult, or they felt that they didn't know a sufficient amount of Lacan, or there were different reasons that were given. And I went to the library and checked out Anti-Oedipus because I was curious what were they looking at that caused them so much difficulty. And I certainly can't say that I opened it up and had an understanding of what was happening on the page. But I will say it was really exciting. It made me laugh. And I saw that Deleuze and Guattari, with great enthusiasm and creativity, were quoting some writers that meant a lot to me, maybe Henry Miller most of all. He was just like a friend, that says some really interesting things, makes you laugh, and has read some of the same writers. You want to spend more time with them. A second thing, the best talk that I ever went to as a graduate student was by Rosie Braidotti. And she mentioned Deleuze multiple times, not surprisingly. And then I was too shy to talk to her afterwards, but I eavesdropped and somebody asked her for a recommendation in terms of something by Deleuze, and she recommended Empiricism and Subjectivity. I checked that book out of the library the next day, and it just so happens that was the very first thing that I ever wrote on as far as Deleuze, was his work on David Hume and empiricism more generally. The last thing, and this is definitely connected to this notion of affirming philosophy, I think I realized that Deleuze was going to get me moving in some new directions. I had gotten extraordinarily comfortable working within parameters that we could call kind of anti-philosophical parameters, a kind of critique of the philosophical tradition. There were a lot of different kind of variations of that, Heideggerian, Derridian, feminist, right? And all of those were extraordinarily influential on me. And I kind of wrote several papers kind of on that in grad school. All of that kind of raised a question of what next? And especially, what did it mean that I was operating under the heading of philosophy within the university and spending all my time critiquing philosophy, right? And I think early on, I realized that Deleuze had created a very different set of parameters for thinking about what philosophy has been and could be, and that I needed those parameters, including I needed them to have a better understanding of what exactly I was up to in the academic environment, especially because so much of that environment was pretty alienating for me.
So as somebody who's taught Deleuze, and of course doing the dissertation on Deleuze, when someone encounters the work of Deleuze or Deleuze and Guattari for the first time, what do you think, or what in your experience, is the sort of most disorienting thing to students?
It probably depends upon the book that they're looking at, but some general things. If what they're looking at is Anti-Oedipus or 1,000 Plateaus, those books are immediately right? Like so different, such different reading experiences from the very first sentence on. So I think that kind of throws people for a loop. The sheer number of kind of mediators that are brought into play in the work with Guattari, but also in books like Logic of Sense and Difference in Repetition. If what we're thinking about is books like the texts on Nietzsche, Bergson, Hume, Spinoza, I think that for a lot of students who are familiar with, if nothing else, certain things that people say about those writers, they quickly discover that the kind of easy formulaic readings they just don't get you very far in terms of Deleuze's treatments. And so I think that can be disorienting. And then last thing that comes to mind is whether he's kind of reactivating a concept initiated by an earlier philosopher or creating with a whole host of mediators, right? Like some new concept. Those things are so damn dense, right? And so I think all of us have had this experience of kind of working our way through the kind of complex lines of thought of these concepts. And in each case and now, right, like Deleuze has taken us here, and here is an alternative, not just to one way of thinking, but a whole host of ways of thinking. And I think that a lot of people, and this was especially the case in terms of early scholarship on Deleuze, I think people, right, like got burnt out. They didn't have the stamina for it. And so you could see even people who would kind of work with a concept up to a particular point, kind of retreat, and all of a sudden kind of go, well, he's just doing this thing. And then if you look more closely, you realize, well, no, Deleuze is aware of that move, and he draws attention to the fact that he doesn't feel that it's satisfactory. And so, right, like there's these additional moves that he makes. So, I mean, his concepts are dense, unwieldy kind of affairs. I mean, the plus, of course, is if you learn how to kind of work your way through concepts like that, you're just able to do more intellectually, and you're able to get so much more out of your reading just because of the attention to detail and that sense of, no, not here, we need to go further.
Well, we're going to talk about this essay that appears in the appendix of The Logic of Sense, Plato in the Simulacrum. And I think maybe there's one more question before we dive into the text itself. I recently had a Zoom call with you just to catch up. And because we're doing the Logic of Sense reading group starting at the end of January, and I'm going to have a link to the syllabus for that in the show notes, you mentioned that if you were stranded on a deserted island and you could bring but one piece of writing by Deleuze with you, it would be The Logic of Sense. Why do you choose that text in particular?
I think that the big reason is that of Deleuze's books, it contains the most number of passages that just move the hell out of me. And it's also the case that, as with the other books, I mean, my God, there's so much going on. And the cool thing about approaching The Logic of Sense, if you've enjoyed something else by Deleuze, is there's a very good chance that he's going to say things in The Logic of Sense that are directly connected to things that you found exciting in other books, and also maybe help you better understand some of the moves that he makes in other books. But I think above all else, I think it has some of his best and most powerful writing. And maybe I'll just give you kind of two examples of that. There's the series in which he raises the question of what it means to be a Stoic, what it means to live as a Stoic. And near the beginning of that section, he says either ethics makes no sense at all, or this is what it means and has nothing else to say, not to be unworthy of what happens to us. And it's a beautiful line in what is an extraordinarily kind of beautiful discussion of Stoicism, one that goes well beyond a lot of the kind of parameters that are there in kind of contemporary Stoicism. And then the logic of sense involves Deleuze, right, like overturning Platonism in a way that involves advancing a different theory of actualization. Different ways of describing it, but I like that. I mean, for Deleuze, part of what philosophers have done is create different theories of actualization. And the one that he developed working with Stoic philosophy of language, he pushes in such a way that we see, I don't know, just a very kind of powerful discussion of what it means to experiment with life. My God, one of the examples that he gives of a kind of immaterial sense or idea that's actualized is alcoholism. So right away, we know, okay, we're operating on an incredibly different kind of terrain of actualization than what we tend to think of in terms of Plato discussing a form and its representations.
I don't think you can leave that comment sit as it is. Could you just expand more on the way that he uses alcoholism before we start digging into the logic of sense ourselves?
A few things that I'll just kind of throw out there. One is that readers of Deleuze have no doubt noticed the like philosophical use of the expression sobriety in Deleuze's writings. And so he'll say at certain points, right, like, are we sober enough to attempt the following? Right. So there's a whole kind of like language of intoxication and sobriety in Deleuze's work. In the logic of sense, alcoholism comes into play at different points. There's a discussion of Fitzgerald and cracking up, which readers of 1,000 Plateaus will kind of recognize from the what happened, right, like novella Plateau. And so there's a whole discussion of Fitzgerald's alcoholism. And then Deleuze, in an ethical vein, talks about what would it mean to have our bodies actualize the event of alcoholism, but not go too far, just be a little bit of an alcoholic, right? And here, I think there's a reference to, right, like the actor in actualization, right? Like, what does it mean for an actor to play an alcoholic? Obviously, it means for them to reorganize their body in such a way that it takes on, right, like the meaning of alcoholic, right? But of course, doing so in a way that they don't suffer the catastrophic side of alcoholism. And so that whole discussion of reorganizing the body, another kind of meaning being actualized, but in a way that involves risks, where the challenge is to avoid the catastrophic. Those are all kind of right, like big themes, I think, in terms of Deleuzean ethics.
No, yeah, thank you. I mean, what was interesting as well when you're going through the series in Deleuze and the logic of sense is that because you're using Deleuze's conceptual grammar in logic of sense, which talks about actualizing meanings and producing senses. But what you didn't use, and which is good because Deleuze would never use it either, is appearances. There is no discussion of appearances here such that there's a division between what merely appears and a kind of a truth hiding behind it. And this really gets us into the heart of the text from the appendix, Plato and the Simulacrum, because he says to reverse Platonism is to abolish both the worlds of the essence and the appearance. And he says, well, okay, I'm not going to be the first person to do this. Not even Nietzsche was the first person to do this. Hegel tried it. He almost makes a very Hegelian move in this text, but I'm sorry, Hegelians, he didn't make it. I was looking for it, but he didn't do it. There's this move Hegelians do when you put the division between essence and appearance into the essence itself, and it all collapses. Sadly, he does not pull this one, so we can't go, we've seen you do it before. No, what Deleuze wants to do to sort of read Plato in a very Nietzschean way, but also in a very close way, and I don't think an unfaithful way, is to look for the motivation behind this division between the world of appearances and the world of essences. And I've actually found it quite convincing. It's one of the most convincing Deleuze texts I think one can read if you want like an introduction to Deleuze through something that's a bit more familiar, such as Plato. I mean, this idea of reversing Platonism, I mean, we talk about the motives for Platonism, as that's the thing we're looking for. But what would it mean? And I mean, what do we think collectively here it means to reverse Platonism, or why would we necessarily want to?
I mean, we've got to attempt some kind of answer to that question before we part company this morning. Maybe taking a little bit of a step back and thinking about the definition of Platonism. Part of the humor of the opening pages of this piece and this question of the motivation of Platonism is Deleuze really restaging Plato's The Sophist, where in The Sophist, there's this whole language of the hunt and trying to trap the most elusive of praise, the sophist. And so the text unfolds in this effort to define something that has a tendency of escaping from every definition. And so Deleuze then, at the beginning of Plato and Simulacrum, is like, well, we're going to hunt for the essence of Platonism, right? And that means if we have to hunt for it, that it too is an elusive prey. And that means that many of the familiar ways of defining Platonism won't do. And I think Deleuze makes pretty clear what the familiar ways of defining Platonism are that, in his mind, don't work. One would be just equating Platonism with a belief in the existence of forms. And then a big one would be the view that if you're not dealing with a form, you're dealing with a sensible particular that is what it is because of an internal connection to a form. You're dealing with a representation. So what you have is forms and representations, or forms and copies, genuine likenesses of forms. And then the last one would be this kind of move where you conflate Platonic division and Aristotelian division. I think we get this when people say, well, Aristotle brought Plato down from the heavens. There's the view, rightly or wrongly, that Plato regards forms as existing apart from the sensible particulars that actualize them. And then the idea is, well, Aristotle is working with the same kind of notion of essence and its actualization. It's just that he regards that essence as a immanent rather than a transcendent cause. And so Deleuze is like, no. We need to hunt for kind of Platonism. And then the definition that he gives us of Platonism is that it's a contest that Plato stages among rivals, philosophy's rivals being the sophist, the orator, the poet, the tyrant. The strategy that Plato employs for winning that contest is to enact a distinction, where this is a distinction within the world of sensible particulars between those that are genuine likenesses and the counterfeit, or the representation and the simulacra. And so then that's kind of him describing Platonism as a practice of division. Is this particular representation, or is it this counterfeit, right? This thing that maybe people look at and believe has something to do with, let's say, justice or beauty or what have you, but in reality is just the decoy or the counterfeit. And then there's a kind of pivot, and Plato is presented as founding this domain of representation. And so now, right, like Deleuze is not so much interested in Plato's distinction between the representation and the simulacrum, but he's focusing on the relationship between forms and representations. And then he presents subsequent thinkers as extending, always creatively, this order of representation. And so that's when Aristotle comes back in as extending the order of representation, but with limits. And then you have, right, the kind of referencing of Hegel and Leibniz in one of these just kind of passages where Deleuze is on an absolute tear, and we're just trying to hang in there. And so I think this question, what does it mean to overturn Platonism, is obviously so central in terms of this piece and the kind of Deleuzean project. But we've got a few kind of different components in terms of what he means by Platonism. I can kind of keep going and talk a little bit about the overturning if you want, but maybe.
No, but that's fantastic. But let's zoom in, as you said, on some of those components of Platonism here. So, like, so for listeners, if you think of a typical Platonic dialogue, let's go for the Republic, or go for many of the, particularly the middle period dialogues. For Plato, it starts with this idea of we select something to be up for contest because they're always structured in the same way of this narrative of Socrates, who is told, you are the wisest man in Athens, and then he says, well, I don't know, I know jack shit, so I need to go test everyone who says they know anything and to prove that I actually don't know anything, because clearly everyone else knows everything out there. And then what he does ends up doing is testing claims to the truth when he asks people these definitional questions. And they'll give, for example, answers that are like paradigm cases. They'll give examples, and he will say, no, these examples are bullshit, because he will sort of lead them into a contradiction such that the examples can never fit a universalized abstract definition. And we could call that the formed Platonic ideal, so to speak. But I think one of the things that Deleuze draws attention to is it's not just this division between essences and examples of them or representations of them and the dialectic, the famous Socratic questioning, where you just keep asking someone questions until they say something that's contradictory. Rather, there's that third part of the structure of these Platonic methods, Platonic dialogues, which almost always shows up in them, which is once you have reached a kind of an impasse through the dialectic, and it seems, oh, okay, all of the people you've asked clearly don't have a fixed definition that fits all times, because we need that for everything, apparently. It's then Socrates would show up and say, it's okay, what this means has got nothing to do with the dialect. He will leave the dialectic behind and instead appeal to myth. He'll appeal to mythology. And I guess one thing to get into is how Deleuze thinks that Plato uses this mythology in a way which isn't actually a break from the rest of this process of division and dialectic, but actually is kind of more of the foundation of it, insofar as if you're going to test the most well-founded of claims to be adequate to the essence or the form of something, that form can't actually be grounded in dialectic itself. It does actually remind me a little bit of what he would say in Nietzsche and philosophy about the nihilism of the dialectic, because nothing is going to be fully adequate to it. And instead we have to appeal to myth, which was almost, seems like it was hiding there the entire time, but he's also saying, Socrates is almost saying, okay, well, we all believe in these myths, which you won't question, which I could if I wanted to, that's why you're going to kill me, but eventually, and my God, they should have done it faster, but in the meantime, Socrates is appealing to sort of like the base presuppositions of society around him. And I wanted to ask how you think that fits into this reading of Platonism.
Yeah, maybe I'll first kind of touch on, since you brought up the Republic, where we see the division in the Republic between the representation and the simulacrum. And then I'll say a couple words about myth in the Platonic dialogues and right, like the way kind of Deleuze references that. I think he says somewhere in the piece, right? To understand Platonic division, you have to talk about myth and the use of myth, right? And so how is it connected to this practice of selection, division, etc.? There are a lot of places in Plato's writing where you can see him clearly making this distinction between something that is what it is because it's connected to the form, and something that is not connected to the form at all, but is seductive and that has a kind of power to confuse, disorient, and people to attach, right, like a greater value to it than it deserves. In the Republic, there's the critique of poetry. And even though I don't recall Deleuze referencing this directly in Plato and the Simulacrum, the Republic lines up perfectly, I think, with aspects of his analysis. And you might recall how Deleuze says this copy of a copy thing does not work when people start talking about Plato. Well, I don't think we find that reading more prevalent than in discussions of the critique of poetry in the Republic. People will say, well, the critique of poetry is that it's not a copy of the form justice. It's only a copy of the form justice. But Plato does not say that. And in fact, if he did say it, it would be surprising given other dialogues where he insists whatever the language we use, even if it's the same word, we need to recognize a difference in kind between particulars that are connected to the forms and what he often calls phantasms. And so I think what happens is people are at like the middle of the Republic, and they're coming already with a certain understanding of Platonism. And there they see a discussion of forms and other things that are resemblances of forms. And they kind of like lock into that as the whole like picture of reality. And then when they get to book 10, where Plato says, no, we need a third category, the only way they're able to understand that third category is it's going to be this relationship of copying, but it's going to be an inferior copy, a copy of a copy. But what we're told by Socrates is that poetry is an imitation of other sensible particulars, not as they are, but as they appear. And right, like the language is, they're an imitation of a phantasm. And of course, everything that then follows is this picture of stories, like having a tremendous power. We like to lose ourselves in stories, right? But often stories work on the irrational parts of ourselves. They're not connected to any kind of commitment to understanding. And so the problem is not that people sucked into epic poetry are only consuming a copy of a copy. The problem is that their sense of morality is being completely warped and misshaped so that the kinds of sensible things that they see as connected to justice aren't connected to justice at all. They're unjust things rather than just things. And that's such I would say, typical Platonic strategy. There's the rival of poetry. And how do you beat the rival through a definition? But the definition doesn't involve just the typical way people think of that rival. Rather, it involves defining the rival as a counterfeit, as a phantasm. What Deleuze is referring to as myths here, I think is really useful or interesting in this context, because part of what he's referring to is stories that in Plato's writings are explicitly characterized by his philosophical characters as stories. So there are these really interesting moments in Plato's dialogues where philosopher Socrates or the visitor from Aelia will say, okay, let's take a break from this whole explanation, giving an account kind of thing. And let me tell you a story. And it's interesting because I would say that that story is always positioned as a work of fiction by Socrates or the stranger from Aelia. So there'll always be this line of, you'd have to be silly to believe all of this were true. And then often, Plato will have his characters say, hey, I'm not coming up with all the elements of these stories. You've heard stories like these before, right? What do these stories, especially when they're at the end of a Platonic dialogue, the Republic, the Phaedo, what do the stories consist of? They're stories of an afterlife, and afterlife is a time of judgment. And it's a time of judgment in which those who have lived philosophically win. And those who don't, it doesn't turn out well. They're thrown into Tartarus. They're stuck in some sort of purgatory. And so, the division continues. The selection, division, hierarchy continues in these stories of the afterlife. They're positioned as stories, works of fiction, which also means that there is a refusal to allow the philosophical rival of poetry to have a monopoly on the power of fiction. Just as in the Gorgias, there's a refusal to have oratory have a monopoly on the power of persuasion. The idea is philosophy wins the game by appropriating the rival's powers, but making them something different, right? Like connecting them to the logos, like an effort to understand.
No, it's good you brought up the Gorgias, actually, because I was really thinking about when, Socrates goes on this weird diatribe about how cooking is an art. He makes this distinction between it's tech, you have craft, techne, and what I can't remember the name in Greek, but it gets translated in English as a knack. So he says cooking is an art. That's just kind of flattery because the real need for nutrition is health, and therefore there is. And he says, I think I've actually got the Gorgias up here. He says a definition of a knack, as opposed to an art, is a knack is unable to explain or to give a reason of the nature of its own applications, which I find is really interesting. I mean, if you're thinking about the idea of, even going back to my favorite dialogues, which is Laches, which is about the nature of courage, Socrates is basically saying to these people that you may have done this courageous thing. However, I can define it. So I'm the one who says whether or not you're fucking courageous or not.
Yeah, that's right.
And I know nothing. I know nothing. I know you know nothing, but I really do know nothing. Who is this guy to think that he knows nothing? And there is this aspect of, I guess, legal evaluation here, as he's saying, that is trying to tie everything back to, and this is what Deleuze is going to say, of course, to a logic of identity and against the rivals of poetry. And of course, who is the god of poetry in this kind of dissemblance and differential ecstasy? It is Dionysus. And I think this is one of the good things about this text is you get more of a sense of, okay, he's not just going for Dionysus because he really likes wine and theatre. There was actually something of a power struggle happening in this Greek world that Plato was something initiating. But no, so Craig, I know I've gone quite a bit as well. But I know you are a resident Dionysian expert here.
I think an important question, maybe to sort of scale back the discussion a little bit, and it'll go back to something we talked about early on in our conversation, is the role of Deleuze's mediators, namely Nietzsche, who's named right at the top of the very essay. And if we were to extend the metaphor of the hunt for the fugitive, I mean, we could say that Nietzsche is kind of a field captain of sorts, but also somebody who's not named is Henri Bergson, who I would say is kind of functioning in the background, is at the command center in a way. And one of the ways that Nietzsche and Bergson overlap is in their own rendering of a new value for falsity, which then appears in Deleuze's work as the powers of the false. We know Bergson for his concept of false problems, and we have Nietzsche more closely related to the power of the false. In fact, the essay culminates in Nietzsche's eternal return and the idea of the power of the false. And it brings into question, what is the role of truth and falsity in Deleuze's work and methodology here as it pertains to his reversal of Platonism? Because on the one hand, the one extraordinary thing that Deleuze does is he dispels the notion that our relation to the forms in Platonic heaven is one structured by a set of external relations. Rather, he shows that there's something else. It's creating a set of internal relations such that it effectuates a sort of scale of truth and falsity relative to the idea. But then there is something else informing the idea. And this is the big takeaway, I think, from this essay, which is, how is it that Plato himself tries, and in Deleuze's view, tries to fend off the notion of difference so that it does not appear and that it remains concealed, and that it allows, for example, things like poetry and artistry to win out and claim falsity as in the province of those enterprises or disciplines. So I know that's a big question. I guess the easy part of the question is, like, what is the relationship of Nietzsche and Bergson to Deleuze's methodology? But then maybe more broadly, how does the whole rethinking or revaluing or reconfiguring of truth and falsity factor in here?
So the easier of the two questions is not the easier of the questions for me at all. But I'll piggyback off of a couple things that you said. One, I just want to highlight your remarks about like how Deleuze sees Plato fending off difference, because I think that any reader working their way through the section of the text where Deleuze goes on that just tear as far as the history of philosophy, and we get that sequence of Plato, Aristotle, Leibniz, and Hegel. I think if they ask the same question with regards to each figure, this is how does Deleuze see this figure as fending off difference, you're going to get a sense of what he means by the order of representation, its scope, and then also how it's extended through like very creative moves, so that it's very difficult to just give that one sentence, well, here's what Deleuze means by the order of representation. But your language of fending off difference is very close to the closest we get to that kind of shorthand from Deleuze when he talks about a double exigency of the same and the similar. And there will even be these kind of things where, like, Deleuze sees, I think, both Leibniz and Hegel as philosophers who bring in difference in a much more powerful and dramatic way than the previous thinkers that he mentions in this account of the order representation. So then, like, to understand why he's locating them still within that same order, you have to ask that same question you asked with regards to Plato, with regards to them. With regards to Plato, You just go, where is difference in Plato according to Deleuze? Well, certainly, right, like the difference between the representation and the simulacrum. But let's remember when he's kind of laying out the domain of representation, that notion, he's pushed that distinction somewhat off to the side, focusing on this notion of a form and its representation. And so maybe there are different forms, but a form is not itself a difference. Rather, Plato describes the form as the same as itself, right? So that's important for Deleuze. And then you have the difference between the form and its actualizations, right? And that is obviously an important area of difference. But here, the actualization is being understood in terms of the notion of resemblance, similarity, right? Like representation, model versus copy. So that's a way of roping off a more radical kind of notion of difference. This is connected to Deleuze's question, what would it mean to think the relationship between the condition and the condition, the ground and the grounded, in such a way that we're not thinking in terms of representation, resemblance, imitation, copying. And this is right, like also the question, right? Like, what does it mean to kind of think of the process of actualization in a way where there's a more significant difference between the actualized and the principle that's being actualized? That was one of the things I wanted to piggyback off of. I've forgotten the other because I went on and on in terms of...
Oh, it's fine. But maybe I'll just circle back just to the concept of the powers of the false. Well, I'll say first, too, that when you read across Deleuze's work and see various iterations of this concept, it's used or deployed in different ways. Like in the cinema books, for example, the powers of the false become the very conditions by which we can think the construction of the cinematic image in new ways. Here, we're getting a more on-the-nose, very pointed ontological or metaphysical usage in its more proper sense, I guess you would say. But when we hear this term, the power of the false, what does Deleuze mean by that? How does he use that, generally speaking? And how is it used here?
Definitely, I tend to think about Nietzsche in this regard, right? And his discussion of philosophy's will to truth is kind of positioning the true and the false as these opposite values. And then, I mean, for example, in part one of Beyond Good and Evil, this kind of interesting discussion of philosophical systems as powerful displays of creativity, but powerful displays of creativity that are thought of in terms of these opposite values of, right, like this is the truth, meaning not an appearance, not a perspective, not an opinion, right? In terms of Deleuze, I think one of the things that this means is that Deleuze never separates philosophical understanding from creativity. That's what like philosophy gives us in terms of how we think about the world. It has always been like a display of creativity, although it's not often been recognized as such. And I think that one of Deleuze's questions is always, what would it mean to not hide or dodge philosophical creativity? What would it mean to knowingly push philosophical creativity to the limit? That doesn't mean that there isn't a discussion of understanding in Deleuze, but there's a refusal to separate understanding from creativity, whether we're talking about philosophy or we're talking about literature or about science. All of these are things that kind of contribute to our understanding of ourselves and the world. And they're all, right, creative mediums.
No, yeah, I think going back to creation is really important, because I think one of the good things about Deleuze going all of the way back to Plato, as Nietzsche does, is because if I want to go to a philosophical question about life, as you're talking about, what is the point of philosophy for Plato? And here we can be pretty Nietzschean about it, because Plato does just say it. The point of philosophy is not to live a good life. The point of philosophy is not to live, especially not to live again. Because if you look at the Platonic sort of metaphysics, there's a cycle of death and rebirth, and the point of becoming a philosopher is to escape this cycle so that you have, the best knowledge of the forms, you adequate the forms so much that they cannot even be reactualized, because to be actualized is to, in a sense, to fall from the perfect into the changeable. And this is one of the key Platonic ideas, listeners, is that the perfect cannot change. That is one of the Platonic ideas par excellence. So to achieve perfection, you need to die and stay fucking dead. This is, and it is fundamentally, this is why it's so convincing to the extent that when you look at someone like Nietzsche, this isn't anti-life philosophy. It's that no, cooking is just a knack. The point is for medicine. And of course, when Socrates dies, he says, I think it's to Crito, offer a cock up to Asclepius, the god of medicine, because he's saying that, thank you, you have cured me from being alive. So we've gone from this, starting off with this narrative of Socrates is very insecure about being told that he's the most knowledgeable man in Athens, to actually this is all about, as Socrates will say at one point, learning how to die. And so when it comes to the philosophy of life, it does really bring back, as Greg was discussing with the idea of the powers of the false, the value of truth. If the entire point of the truth and the model of thinking and inquiry and truth that is being offered by Platonism and its inheritance through the history of Western metaphysics, to use a sort of term from Heidegger, who was a philosopher who didn't learn how to die quickly enough, sadly. This really is a question of what is the value of truth? If it just a matter, if truth's sole value is dying and defending yourself from the most pedantic man in Athens, it has become quite tempting with this. It does become more affecting. And so when it comes to the idea of repressing difference in Plato, difference is repressed because to be different is to be alive. And so therefore we have to sort of shave these edges off of differentiation so we can resemble the ideal, the form, the essence. But if we're going to follow Deleuze with this project of abolishing the distinction between the appearance and essence, and instead say that the world is all about simulacra, the principle that Deleuze gives of this is that rather than it being the case that, for example, only things that resemble a prior identity, a prior truth, can differ in this kind of falling from the identity or falling from the truth, he says that the world of simulacra is one in which actually it's the other way around. Only differences can resemble one another. An identity is actually itself a simulation, a kind of metastability of difference. Listeners, if you want to take an example, take the identity of a year, because the year seems very stable, but it's a stability that emerges out of motion. And even the solar system itself is in motion. It's part of a universe that's expanding and accelerating. So all of these identities are simulations of stability on, let's call it, an ocean of differentiation of different kinds of quantities. But this also, in this reversion, insofar as it is not simply an abolition of Platonism, but also an inversion or a reversal of Platonism, it nonetheless takes up some of its key components. And this is sort of the big Nietzschean question. What is the role of the myth if we take this reversal to its highest point in the way that Deleuze wants us to?
Well,
sorry, that was a long rant.
I really found all of your comments helpful, and you got me thinking about, because I think it lines up exactly with your reading, a place where you do see Plato directly connect philosophy and creativity. And that's in the symposium. And right, like Socrates' speech in the symposium, living philosophically involves the creation of new ways of thinking, the creation of new intellectual communities. It's not just a cerebral affair in which we contemplate an object, but there's a kind of transformation of how one thinks, feels, and lives that has as its culmination the contemplation of the form beauty, in which case you realize that you've turned your life into a representation of that form beauty. So it's the kind of secret of the journey that you've been on. But this is just a way of saying that a place where Plato himself is insisting philosophy is dramatically creative, right? Like is tethered to the notion of representation, that creativity is a representation of that form beauty. And so what would it mean to think creativity in a way that isn't tethered to the notion of representation? What would it mean to think the reorganization of one's life in a way that isn't tethered to that notion of representation? And then, thinking about the Phaedo, what would it mean to think about philosophical transformation in a way that is more life affirming, that's giving us a more inspiring picture of what life is about than we get from Socrates in those final hours? Your question in terms of the role of myth. Yeah, maybe could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sorry, this is me doing showrun stuff. I've always wanted to talk about the eternal return part towards the end of the essay.
Well, we can definitely do that.
No, because I was thinking about because he says that it seems like he's saying that the reason why Nietzsche is the person to go for the proper reversal of Platonism and not Leibniz or Hegel is that the only mythic model that's appropriate to this idea of a world of simulacra is this kind of chaos that you see repressed in Platonism that he finds in Nietzsche. And I'm not too, I mean, is the eternal, I mean, I don't know if the eternal return is the most fitting myth for that, but it seems like that's what he's definitely pointing us towards. Although, could there be another myth other than simply just chucking all in with Nietzsche? Although it's Deleuze's Nietzsche, which of course is its own transformation of these traditional ways of reading it.
Yeah, I think like the final section of the text could be, especially I've never really done this, but because we were talking earlier about myth and Plato, and in difference and repetition, right? Like the line about overturning Platonism includes that important qualifier that it's not only inevitable that certain components of Platonism will be retained, it's desirable. And so maybe the idea is, what are maybe alternative myths that we need if we're going to live beyond the domain of representation? We know, like in the preceding section, Deleuze enters into, let's say, an alliance with what for Plato is philosophy's rival, right? Enters into an alliance in Deleuze's case with contemporary art, because he thinks that there are specific examples of contemporary art that move us beyond the domain of representation, because they're examples of systems in which identity is a function of difference. And so consequently, right, like this kind of rigid opposition between identity and difference, or being and becoming, or order and chaos. Engaging with these works of art can help us begin to kind of think outside of that logic of representation. And then maybe, right, like the concluding section is one in which Deleuze is positioning eternal recurrence as an alternative metaphysical myth in terms of the order of representation. And then, right, when Deleuze discusses eternal recurrence, along with a conception of reality in which the oppositions between the true and the false, being and becoming, ordering chaos, right, all of that's undone, there's a whole practical dimension in terms of eternal recurrence. It's a whole, right, like a guerrilla campaign against oneself that one engages into. And although I don't recall him getting into those aspects of his treatment of eternal recurrence in the essay, it's certainly kind of worth thinking about, especially when you think about the overturning of Platonism within, right, like the logic of sense.
I think we're going to kind of move towards wrapping up this portion of the conversation. And I think a big question that falls out of not only reading this particular essay, but Deleuze more generally, if Platonism can be understood, for example, as the attempt to secure foundations, establish hierarchy, and develop a criteria for legitimacy, models, copies, proper participation, what then does Deleuze think becomes possible once these safeguards are suspended? And maybe the more pointed question is, in the absence of not only a criteria of legitimacy, but what we would call the conditions for the intelligibility of our world, Plato offers us a way to understand the world. In the absence of those secure foundations, how does Deleuze see the world as intelligible? Or how does an understanding of the world proceed from this reversal of Platonism, and what forms of life come out of that?
It's a great question, in part because, right, like Deleuze himself is always saying that when you engage with a particular philosopher, as much as you want to be attentive to the conceptual details, you want to, at some point, be able to kind of discern a certain style of thinking and a certain way of looking at things in the world. And so I guess, right, like there's two kind of questions. One would maybe be, how did Deleuze look at the world? What did he see kind of in the world? And I guess the shorthand would be, right, like a lot of difference, right? But I think when we engage with specific texts by Deleuze and really get into the middle of them, we start to look at the world differently. So in terms of something like logic of sense, what we start to see is different mixtures of bodies, right? Different kinds of, right, like physical mixtures. And because we're philosophers, we also see these mixtures of bodies as having a meaning, which is to say, we see them as actualizing certain, right, like senses. Right? That's in Plato. Right. But less of the discussion of, right, like corporal mixtures than what we get in Stoicism for Deleuze. But this idea of looking around the world and seeing things as actualizing particular immaterial senses, I think Deleuze thinks that that's an important thing that philosophers do. The question is, can we do this differently, in a better way, and one that gives us ultimately a more concrete, I think, way of looking at the things around us? And so this idea of different physical mixtures actualizing immaterial senses, where those senses are events. And one of the things that really interested Deleuze and Guattari are moments in which the meaning of physical mixtures can dramatically shift. So examples in 1,000 Plateaus, like this is a hijacking, or a verdict in a trial, right? Like you're guilty, right? In a way, that sense doesn't physically alter anything, but it changes things dramatically. Everything's different, including what's going to unfold physically from that point on. But with other books, right? Like part of the order of representation is very much kind of looking at individual things and seeing them just as members of particular species. The Plato Aristotle chapter of Deleuze's account of the order of representation very much deals with that way of looking at things. And he draws attention to something that's outside of this. And that's kind of grasping the individual as the individual, noticing, right, that this is something more than just a member of a particular kind. And so readers of Deleuze will recognize that move as one that he makes a lot and that he associates with Spinoza's way of looking at things, right, as units of power. So this kind of retention of Platonic elements, right, and refashioning and redirection, I think for most readers of Deleuze, like really alters how they look at individual things. And then the discussion of becoming in Deleuze and Guattari. I think Deleuze in his own way draws attention to the fact that philosophers going back to antiquity have had becoming at the very center of their understanding of philosophical practice in the sense of, right, like a change in how we're living, right? And so Deleuze very much, I think, sees himself as developing that theme, continuing with that theme, but, right, like freeing it from this notion of representing some kind of, right, like self-identical principle. And with that, there's, right, like a departure from the idea of, right, like this way of living is, right, like the just way of living, right? The embodiment of the good or the embodiment of beauty. And in place of that, we get a whole discussion of what are the ways that we individually and together can experiment with how we're living. What are the risks that we face when it comes to running those experiments? How do we create something new when there's always the risk that everything turns to shit and we're not able to replace what we're so intolerable of, what we find so uninspiring and infuriating? We're unable to replace it with something that's better.
Well, Jay, it's been an absolute pleasure and to have you on the show. And we should have done this 10 years ago. You should have been the first guest on Acid Horizon.
That's so sweet of you to say. Yeah.
Maybe before we sign off, could you just let us know what are some things that you're working on right now or some philosophical trends that you're tracking?
Yeah, I've been working on a book project tentatively titled Confinement, Escape, and Metamorphosis, in which I lay out what I take to be a kind of conceptual theme of confinement and escape in the history of philosophy. And I play that off of escape narratives, especially prison break narratives in literature and memoir. And that's been a really challenging and different project for me, but also super, super rewarding. So trying to finish that up and then move on to some new things.
That's right. You got to finish that, fly out here, stay in my dome, and then we'll edit it one weekend, and then we'll send that thing off.
Yeah, because listeners should know you are the editor of that book, because I pleaded with you to be the editor, because I just can't imagine a better pair of eyes on the thing.